Welcome to Next Round with me, Gael McDermott.
And me, David W. Higgins.
A young Irish look at the economy, politics and society.
Covering home and abroad.
For the thinkers, the dreamers and the doers, this is Next Round. Hello and welcome to the latest episode of Next Round. New research from Stanford University has shown that an additional 13.3 million Americans are additionally single following COVID-19, which is being referred to as the Dating Recession. So we want to discuss the far-reaching effects of this and what effect that's been having on the personal lives of many Americans following the pandemic. It's also been a week of news with respect to interest rate cuts, with the US having a bumper rate cut earlier on this week. The Bank of England in the UK has actually held its rates, following on from the ECB's decision last week to make its cut. It's been a bit of a mixed bag, and we want to look at that and how that will affect the upcoming US election, also in the context of the UK budget as well, which is due at the end of October. And a new poll has been released by the Irish Times and Ipsos, which shows that Fine Gael is now the most popular party in the country, and there's also been a strong increase in support for the leader of Fine Gael and Taoiseach, Simon Harris. So, but the poll also has some results with respect to how people in their 20s and their 30s believe that it is better to live abroad, and that prospects for life abroad seem better than remaining in Ireland. So lots to discuss this week. If you do like this podcast, of course, we would encourage you to please like, share and subscribe to us. We are available on all major podcast platforms. Also available on YouTube. You can subscribe and watch us on our YouTube channel, where you can get us there as well. David, I think lots to discuss and good to see you. We are people who are watching us will see different backgrounds. I am calling in today from Prague, and you're in Dingle.
Yes, yeah, I'm down here remote working, and I'm blessed with the weather that we're having this week. It's shining over the coastline where I am, and I'm sure the weather's decent where you are.
Same. I'm actually battling the sun here. It's slowly getting me here. So I think if you see me kind of avoiding the sun, that is why. But I've been to Prague before, and it's a really beautiful place. Former communist country, of course, as well. And I was looking at a bit of research comparing how has Prague been doing, economically, and one of the pieces that's I think just shows the level of change that can happen in an economy when it embraces a more capitalist market-focused economy. Their GDP per capita, has increased from what was about 8,000 in 1990 to at the end of 2022, 43,000. So significant growth. Prague is also a real FDI capital here in Europe as well, seeing many global companies being attracted to the real talent base within the country. But it is not without its issues. While Prague is a really beautiful place and has amazing restaurants and a real very nice hospitality sector, Prague has also been experiencing a significant housing price boom, with property prices increasing by nearly 80% over the last decade. So even Prague is facing affordability challenges, which is interesting.
Right. Yeah. Dingle has its own challenges, I'd say as well. I mean, I haven't broached this with any locals, but a big complaint in even rural areas, even kind of coastal rural areas, the likes of here, is that housing is available for holiday lets and short term and Airbnb, but it can be hard for locals working in local industries to try and get somewhere permanent to stay. I mean, I spoke to one guy doing kayaking yesterday who travels in from Cahersiveen. So there's long commutes that people do when they don't have availability of rentals locally. Dingle happens to be one of those areas that is outside the rent pressure zones. Rent pressure
Oh, what's
zones
that?
cover
Okay.
around, yeah, rent pressure zones cover around 80% of the country right now,
Okay.
and most urban areas and almost all of the eastern coast is covered by them, where rent increases are capped at the lower of 2% or CPI. And this year, because CPI is now closer to 1% than it is 2%, you'll find many existing tenancies are capped at those levels. But outside of the rent pressure zones, you aren't capped at all. So technically, a landlord can increase by 5 or 10% in one go. Now, because these markets have much lower rents anyway, and because they're less, there's less activity in these areas, landlords have less pressure, less potential to be able to do that anyway. But there are these calls, and it's led by many of the opposition parties to go and increase that basically to cover the whole country and treat it all as being a rent pressure zone. But really, most of the stories of the economy down here in Dingle are good. That the tourism window here at the season. A lot of tourist areas around the country would be just in the summer months. But the thing I hear about Dingle in this part of the world is that it's all year round. That you'll have people coming down for Christmas. You'll have people in the spring getting down as well. Jan Feb can be quite quiet because that's just dismal for every part of the country. But it's good to hear of a town that is buoyant and has plentiful of jobs, and there's a lot of tourists coming through. So that's all good news anyway.
Yeah, no, that's awesome to hear, and good. Glad they had a nice time, especially kayaking. But
a lot of Americans around here.
There is a lot of Well, I mean, it's interesting. I'm here in Prague with a bunch of my global colleagues, and in particular the ones from North America and in particular in the US. Many of them have spoken about how especially in the last 10 years, with connectivity being significantly increased from major US cities into Ireland. American traffic into Ireland has just grown and grown and grown. Again, great to see lots of money coming with that, and lots of Americans spending. I mean, even the U.S. president, former U.S. President Trump, of course, has a golf course in the south of Ireland, right? So
yes, and this is to draw a particular demographic, I think, which is kind of kind of an American baby boomer couple, right? You kind of middle-aged retiree couple. Like my kayak tour yesterday was just all those. It was just all of the Americans, or one or two Australian, but like that demographic of people who are retired, have the retirement set up well because they either had defined benefit pensions or their defined contributions have done well because the stock market has done well. The euro is at a great rate to the dollar right now as well, so it's attractive to come over. So these are the generation of people who were able to buy their houses, were able to get married and have kids. Kids are grown up and moved out. They've been through got them through college because they probably were married early, so those costs came earlier in their lives. Now these people are in the sweet spot where they can go travel the world. And they don't just come to Ireland, go to Dublin, they go all the way down to Dingle as well.
David, what you're describing there sounds to me like a milestone boom, as opposed to a milestone recession, which is something which we keep on referring to here.
Bingo.
And let's pivot, because I think this ties in well to the new research from Stanford University, which I mentioned, that shows how, again, an additional 13.3 million Americans have been single by 2022. And this is being referred to as the Dating Recession, which has had far-reaching consequences on the personal lives of many. So research shows that many informal relationships were disrupted during the pandemic, while married and cohabiting couples remained intact. Singles have been really facing long-lasting isolation. And I know there's a number of stats which we want to call out here, but in particular, which is around face-to-face socializing and the amount of time that we spend together socializing in person uh, has been down to just 4 hours per week, which is lower than in 2019 before the pandemic. So, David, what are some of the main pieces here? Because I think it ranges from alcohol use to housing sizes and the types of places that we're living. But the net here is that we're spending less time with each other, relationships aren't lasting as long, and it's a bit of a perfect storm.
Yeah, it is. And um, where to begin with this? It's such a juicy article. It's a Bloomberg article. I encourage people to go look at it if you can. But what it details is how that time use survey. So less time, more time alone, less time chatting face to face, and less group activities. So not just one-on-one time, but also with other people in the wider
Yeah.
context. They looked at things like data on restaurants, for example. So the US, like many other countries, has had a boom in hospitality coming out of COVID, and it's actually been hard to hire people in some of these sectors. But there's a big difference in the type of hospitality. So traffic at takeout, fast food, fast casual restaurants keeps hitting new records, but traffic at sit down restaurants still hasn't recovered to pre-COVID levels. I was unaware of that in the US. It also mentioned how bars and nightclubs have been struggling. And this all feeds into behaviors that people adopted during the pandemic,
Just
whereby, yeah,
just quickly react on the nightclub piece. On the nightclub piece, this is something which, of course, we've seen in Europe being referenced, where so many nightclubs and almost nightclub culture is really it's disintegrating. I think at a pretty fast pace. I think the amount of like super clubs that used to exist in major European cities has been significantly dented. I can't think of the fact off the top of my head, but I know that piece around culture and nightclub culture is really it's disintegrating at a fast pace.
yeah, Ireland has been a good centre of that as well. The
Mm-hmm.
number of nightclubs, decade on decade, continues to dwindle. You go back to our parents' generation, to the 80s and 90s, there are a much greater number of nightclubs. And what the government here in Ireland has been trying to look at as well, maybe you could stagger the closing times of nightclubs to allow for a more vibrant nightlife. And I think that can be helpful. But if people's behaviors aren't towards going out to them at all, then there may not be much of a help with that change at all, which that change has yet to come in.
Now,
Uh,
and
yeah,
I wonder if one of the pieces around behaviors ties into this, which is when people go to nightclubs, they typically consume alcohol, or
yeah,
depending on your type of nightclubbing, it might be more than just alcohol. But one of the facts which has always stood in my head recently has been over 90 by I think it was 1960, over 90% of people did at least one of alcohol use, cigarette use, or cannabis use.
mm,
And if you fast forward to now, and again, this is just in the US, it's now less than 50% of people do that. So a significant drop off of the use of substances um, in their daily lives. And I wonder if that has an effect on people attending these sort of institutions.
yeah, it definitely does. I mean, we've gotten better at a wide range of health promotional activities in the Western world now. So you see a lot more money towards education in schools. Parenting is a little more kind of helicopter based now. It's like, let's keep Johnny and Mary safe and away from all danger. But it's also a culture that's built up amongst younger people themselves. I mean, having the access to online, I think, is a huge contributor to this as
Yeah.
well. And the access to smartphones, whereby people can get their dopamine hits, their kicks from a screen in front of them, and don't feel the need to get it from other people. And that's a major problem. I mean, I think it's no coincidence that you see some of the big tech CEOs don't let their kids have smartphones or tablets from an early age, and they really restrict their access to this tech because they can see how powerful their tech is. And we're with this emerging generation now that just aren't as comfortable with in-person interaction. See a phone call as being anxiety-inducing. I prefer to be email-based and chat-based instead. And all of that feeds into a kind of a withdrawal from the social world. But humans are social creatures. We are driven hugely by that. And if we don't, adopt social behaviors, then you end up with worse social outcomes. So this article makes a brilliant. There's 4 charts in it, and I'm just going to read out what the 4 charts say. So they look at what key milestones, social milestones, but also economic ones, that a typical 30-year-old in the US hits by age 30. So yeah, by age 30, have you been married, lived with a child, moved out of your parents' house, lived on your own, or owned your own home? And between 1983 and 2023, over a 40-year span, all 4 of those trends have shot downwards. So if you look at living independently, which is kind of moved out of your family home, used to be that over 80% of 30-year-olds in the US had done that. Now it's below 65%. Have you been ever married? That's gone from just under 80% to just under 50%. Do you live with a child, which is typically because you have fathered or mothered that child, less than 60% it used to be. Now it's less than 35%. Owning your own home then, which is a key economic one, used to be attained by nearly half of Americans. Now it's just over 30%. So all of these key social milestones are in a recession. And the data is really clear on that. And I think one of the greatest challenges that faces the young generation today is seeing a bottom and a recovery in those.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think the striking ones are again, I think those kind of owning a home, buying into society, and the wider implications for that, I think is really bad. Having a child, of course, we've spoken about the fertility rate here over the last number of episodes of our podcast, and the effects that's having on the wider economy and how we're going to continue to grow as societies. And of course, living on your own, which is about experiencing life, building relationships, having the opportunity to build successful relationships. I think the outlier is probably the married piece, which is I think people's value of marriage and view of marriage has somewhat changed. I'd be curious to know like what the data is on cohabiting relationships. And that sort of piece. But I think the net of those 4 points is that they're all trending significantly downward. In many cases, all of them have more or less halved in terms of the prevalence of those particular milestones by age 30. And I think one of the pieces as well, David, which is around, I thought that this is interesting, which was how this is then encouraging developers in terms of property sizes, with the number of homes that are below 1,000 square feet in size has significantly increased as well. So there's been a 65% increase in new apartments, which are smaller than 1,000 square feet since 2019, which again is further showing that these kind of single-placed residencies are becoming more and more popular.
For sure. And that's something you're seeing in Ireland as well. A lot of developers have begun to try through the planning system to build studios, one beds as a greater share of apartment blocks. You've had a pretty negative chorus of voices coming out saying, oh, well, that's going to be like slums and they're going to be too small. Look, if you are one person, the studios that are being proposed are actually an appropriate size. Wait, but the bigger issue,
I would say as well, like 1,000. I've lived in Toronto, and I've lived in single one bed condos before. 1,000 square foot is actually quite sizable. You'll see quite commonly now in developments which are trying to accommodate for kind of one person living by themselves. Like, what's actually very common is 500 square foot, 600 square foot. So actually even half the size of that is I'd say more common in major North American cities as well.
Yeah. And so, Ireland actually has a huge catch up to do to meet some of the needs that are out there because we actually have historically just underbuilt in that space anyway. But just back to the wider topic of whether people should be. So I think developers respond to what the social trends are out there. I don't some people in the housing debate in Ireland like to blame developers for trying to lead people to certain social trends. Actually, it's the other way around. I think that people's living habits are kind of that own trend, and then developers trying to respond. A lot of studios and one beds have gotten rejected in Ireland, but there's an interesting trend, Dale, that I picked up on recently, that some developers now are going to look to try and apply to the Irish system for 4 beds. And the view there, 4-bed apartments, and that's the idea that, okay, people may also desire to live alone, but people will also desire to live with friends. Mm-hmm. Now that's its own thing as well, because I consider that to be part of the. I think it's a step away from living with your parents, but it isn't the final step, I think, which is where people do ultimately prefer to live with a romantic partner and to raise family. That's not everyone, but it is such a large, I think, trajectory that enough people go on it that it's a problem when that falls from peak in society, and that's what we have right now. So I think that 4-bed trend, when if it comes on more prevalent, is another sign that our living situations aren't where they should be.
No, and again, it speaks to this piece around loneliness and the epidemic of loneliness, which the U.S. Surgeon General has declared. But look, like people in their 20s, sharing a flat, sharing an apartment with your friend, that isn't uncommon, and it's something which people kind of like to do. But again, I think that the piece around people wanting to live by themselves in the earlier years, establish relationships, and go forward, I think is of course an aspiration as well. So
yeah, there's always going to be a stepping stone of renting, which is at some point in your 20s. I think because we have longer time spent in education now, there's an inevitable tilt on those milestones towards later in life that comes with that. But what I think this data shows is that we've far gone too far the other side. And this data is from the US. It's important to remember that if you run those numbers for Ireland, which I can't really ream off because the US number I quoted was a point in time at age 30. Ireland's data is just done a little differently. I mean, you can look at what the marriage rate is in the early 30s, for example, in the broad 30 to 35. And, for most of the past century, we've had a majority of people being married by the early 30s. But now, for the first time in about a century, we are majority non-married for the first time. So the Irish data shows a similar picture as well.
Yeah, and we've also seen again a further pushing back up those milestones on the likes of buying their home and living alone, etc. So fascinating data. We'll encourage everyone to. We might pop up in the a link to that article on some of the socials, David. But we'll definitely get that shared out. Let's turn to interest rates. So it's been a busy week with central banks. David, the ECB, of course, cut by 25 basis points, which is finance language and economic language for 0.25% to 3.5% last week. The US earlier on this week cut by 0.5%, which was a bumper rate cut, and that went to the 4.75 to 5% range. And in converse to that, the UK actually held. So following its first rate cut in 4 years, from 5.25%, it was more cautious, and they decided to held, noting that if the economy continues to progress in line with expectations, Governor Andrew Bailey said that they want to be cautious about not cutting too fast and too hard or by too much. And I think really this is a case of the UK going a bit slow. In the US, there's expectations here to kind of land the plane, make sure that it's a soft landing. But the UK is doing relatively okay, with unemployment down. There's been no real recession as such. Growth is basically flatlined, but it still has that nagging services inflation there, which was over 5.6% in the summer. And also the context of, of course, monetary and fiscal policy are separate, but the UK budget is scheduled for the end of October, and seeing how that will play, as well as the other rate cuts, what effect they will have. But look, I think just turning to the US side of things, this, what are the implications of this cut? I think the first thing to note is around growth. A big cut like this is usually reserved for times of crisis, and noting that, of course, COVID-19 was the last time it was done at that point. And the question mark here is, does this show or indicate some weakness happening in the US economy, in particular with less than desired labor market data coming out more recently? But Powell, is of the view that the economy is in a good place, and that the belief is that unemployment will peak at 4.4% from the current 4.2%. And the markets have reacted pretty well to this, David. I think just two more things to cover here, and then I think we'd love to kind of dive into a bit more. The S&P 500, the initial reaction on that was down a little on the day it was announced, but yesterday, it closed up at a record high, and it was up 1.7% for the day. And all of this, of course, is in the context of the upcoming US election, with I think this being viewed as a good bump for Kamala Harris and the Harris campaign. The Democrats have reacted well to it. President Biden, of course, welcoming it. And on the other side of things, Trump has reacted negatively, and he's actually using language where he feels that the central bank is, quote, playing politics, which is language we've seen being used by other opposition parties, in particular Canada, actually, where the leader of the opposition, Pierre Poilievre, has really attacked the central bank governor for his policies on and how they affect the economy. Next Fed meeting is scheduled for November 6 and 7, just after the US election, which I think is interesting. But I think the question mark here, David, is twofold. Is the UK being too risk adverse? And will this have a tipping point in favor for the Democrats in the US election?
Well, the differences between the UK and US were big in the rate decision, 50 bips versus no change at all. But when I look at some of the inflation metrics between the two regions, there isn't as big of a difference. So you mentioned that services inflation in the UK was over 5.6, 5.7% through the summer. Similar number in the US is 5.0, but still quite elevated. I mean, when you look then out what the forecasts are for inflation, there is a metric it's called the 5-year forward inflation swap. Just the summary of what that means is that it's the market. Yeah, it's the market's bet of what inflation is going to be across the next 5 years. Now, the UK comes out more elevated than that. It comes in at 3.3%, whereas the US is 2.5%. Euro area, just to mention as well, is 2.2%. That is still quite elevated. So I think what I can say broadly across the board, whether it's the UK, Euro area, or US, is that I don't expect the pace of rate cuts to stay especially high, and I don't expect them to, for 50 bips to be followed by another 50 and another 50. There has to be some caution here. I think that the first 50 was warranted because of market moves that we had earlier in the summer that very much put pressure on the Fed. And you know, there's a debate in this world as to whether the Fed is leading the markets or the markets are leading the Fed, or whatever central bank you're talking about. And really, it is actually more about what the markets are doing. Markets kind of price in expected rate cuts, and then central banks tend to deliver them. And what the expectations are for the Fed now is a much more moderate pace from here onwards, and it makes sense when the 5-year outlook towards inflation continues to be quite elevated and continues to be above the 2% target that central banks you have. Ireland, as I mentioned, has become a bit of an outlier in that our inflation rate has hit closer to 1%, so we're firmly below.
Canada's down below 2 as well.
Yes. But what really matters is in the euro area, it matters about that euro area number, which is higher than the Irish number, and for that reason, I think we're gonna continue to have relatively tight policy. I mean, Ireland's economy right now absolutely needs tight policy because of how boomy things are. This is something that John Fitzgerald highlighted in a recent article, where he said that the Irish economy is running very hot, that of the 90,000 additional jobs added in 2023, that 50,000 were hirings from persons abroad, or at least, citizenship that wasn't from Ireland. And that points to how, when the Irish economy gets so hot, we need to hire abroad. And that's a great metric of how just really, really hot the economy is. Last time you had an economy this hot was the late 2000s. So having high rates, I think, is actually important for keeping a bit of an anchor on some of the growth that we've seen. Now, the other point to look at, you mentioned, was the US election. What's the outlook for that? I mean, I think a rate cut is something that, if you have this, there's quite a Goldilocks situation in the US right now, right? So CPI is getting under control, rates are coming down, growth remains quite buoyant. Those three factors are a good backdrop for the Democrats because they are seen as the incumbent party.
Mm-hmm. The pushback on that, of course, would be they were the incumbent party while inflation was significantly higher as well, right? And yes, while it's coming down, it's still an increase, right? And I think that is the thing which they have to contend with. So, look, I think it's an interesting kind of perfect storm as well in the US, and we'll be curious to see how this goes. Actually, David, this is something I want to ask about, which is this whole idea of central banks being independent or not, with Donald Trump saying that this is an example of the Fed playing politics. We've seen this being used by centre-right politicians across the world, starting to really tackle this, the independence of central banks and independent central banking. Do you think we're entering a phase where independent central banking may no longer last?
Yeah, we've seen a weakening of that independence. I mean, the independence of central banks is a relatively recent phenomenon. Mm-hmm. You only have to go back to the Tony Blair government of the late 90s when they made the Bank of England independent. Before the creation of the euro in the late 90s, you had central banks across Europe that were all different and were all setting monetary policy with various levels of independence, some with, some without. The ECB happens to be very independent because Lagarde is there for a fixed period of time. She can't be kicked out. For that reason, it's very hard to put political pressure on her. The US is different because at any given time, the president can come along and replace the Fed chair. So they're a little more beholden to what the president of the day wants. So certainly if Trump is back in, he's going to exert pressure. He's going to replace Powell, firstly, and he is going to exert political pressure on him. But of course, Trump did appoint Powell and did exert pressure on him during Trump's time in office, but Powell actually resisted and didn't want to, at the time, cut rates. So Trump is very much a cut rate politician. That puts him up there with the likes of President Erdogan in Turkey, who presides over massive hyperinflation. And that's the thing to remember about central bank independence. When you don't have it, monetary policy tends to be worse, and you tend to end up with hyperinflation.
Oh yeah, for
So
sure.
for all the talk of Trump being, the guy who didn't have inflation and would, come in off the back of Biden, who had lots of inflation, there's a risk entirely that if the US messes up its central bank independence, that it could be on a much worse trajectory for cost of living than it has been.
Yeah, and of course that's also under the context of an extremely indebted general population as well, and that might finally kick them over the edge. Fascinating stuff. Let's turn now to polling. The Irish Times had a poll out recently, which shows a significant rise in support for Fine Gael, while the approval rating for Simon Harris has also increased. So the latest Irish Times Ipsos opinion poll shows Fine Gael as the most popular party, with 27% rising 4%. So very much out of the margin of error. Sinn Féin, on the other hand, is showing a continuation in a downhill trend, a 20% drop of 3%. Noting this as well, of course, which is post the release of their well-awaited housing policy, while Fianna Fáil dropped 1 point to 19%. Labour up 1 to 6. Green Party also up 1 to 5%. Again, all within the margin of error, so nothing really significant. Same for the Soc Dems, and no real change to the other parties. People for Profit 2%, Aim 2 at 1%, and Independents down 1 to a pretty sizable 16%. But I think the one call out here is really the approval rating for the Taoiseach, who's seen a 17% increase to 55% approval rating. Micheál Martin up 1 to 47%, while the approval rating for Mary Lou McDonald, the Sinn Féin leader, has dropped as well, and she is at 30%. So I think outlook here is, really, positive trend here for the government. I think there'll be real pressure now on the Taoiseach to call this election and go to the people in November post the budget. I know all of the signs, even actually in terms of when the finance bill and the legislation that's been published and will be laid before Parliament in the Dáil, shows that actually, it doesn't look like they're actually targeting November, which, personally I think is a mistake. So I think that's the one piece around the election, David, but also within the polling, one of the things which calls out is around life prospects, and this is life prospects for young people in their 20s and 30s, and 2/3 of people surveyed in this said that they believe they would have better life prospects overseas than actually remaining in Ireland. So a bit of a mixed bag there from good trend of support for the incumbent government, but young people feeling that actually life is better outside of the country.
Yeah, well, there is that phrase, the grass is always greener on the other side. Indeed. Right? I'm quoting former Taoiseach Varadkar there. But look, on the headline numbers for the government, I mean, this is, I think this is as good as it gets. Now, I might have said that on a previous poll. So, like, my thesis throughout this coalition's term has been that grand coalitions tend not to get re-elected. Yeah. That's one. And the other is that we're going Dutch. And that's what you've seen in a lot of these other countries, Germany, Austria, Netherlands, where they have had these grand coalitions, is that it leads to the creation of other parties, and that the existing smaller parties just do a bit better, and that the grand coalition gets squeezed. Now, we are seeing right now re-election prospects for the three government parties. If those numbers were replicated, okay, Fianna Fáil and Greens will be down, but Fine Gael would actually be up. And that kind of I think notches away at the going Dutch thesis that I've held for some time. So my advice there is to those parties, guys, go sooner. I hear Micheál Martin saying, "Oh, we want to have a February election, just a bit earlier so you don't run the by-elections, but late enough that it's not a November election." Look, I mean, I don't think things get any better for Fianna Fáil in waiting over Christmas as well. I mean, what do you have typically over the winter period. You have higher hospital waiting lists, and Fianna Fáil have the health ministry.
There'll be some sort of health crisis, another flu, something will happen health wise.
Yeah, and then you've got housing being the other big issue as well. I was surprised in this Ipsos poll that they asked a question on which issues is likely to influence you in the general election. And where similar polls have always shown health and housing as being the big issues, cost of living emerged as the biggest one here. So 32% of people marking cost of living, but then only 16% for health, and then 16% for house prices. Now, that's down to how the question is asked. So I think when Ireland Thinks do their polling, they will ask what are the one or two issues that are kind of taking your attention right now. So that will always put immigration higher, because it's what are you seeing in the news as being the big issue. But this is asking, what do you think is going to influence your vote in the general election? And then there was a separate poll done on the issues, just what should the government focus on in the budget? And when given a choice of spending on services, cost of living, reducing taxes, saving for the future, half of people marked help with the cost of living. So that's going to be a key data point, I think, towards deciding on more electricity credits come the budget, whether there'll be even some further support, tax breaks for businesses, to help them with cost of living pressures.
Technically as well, technically housing costs are also built into the cost of living as well, right? So I'm not sure if there's also confusion across. And I know it has separate categories for rent and housing, but it might be baked into the cost of living as well, right?
Yeah, it might. That's probably a fair point about that. And then the piece you mentioned as well, Dale, about living overseas, or better prospects overseas. So this was a question to all adults, but it asked about, do you think young people in their 20s and 30s would have better or worse financial prospects if they move overseas? And 2/3, 66%, responded better. Now, this is also, I'd love to see that response broken down by older people, because it's middle-aged older who are being asked as well to say, okay, what do you think is the better prospects? So it's not just what young people think of their own prospects, it's also what the elders think of them. But anyway, what it finds is this overwhelming majority saying better. 22% said it would be about the same. And then only a small single digits were saying it would be worse life prospects or don't know. Now, what I'd also say here is that, I think it's become a big Irish rite of passage to do some bit of time abroad because of the links that we have to other countries. I think in the round, the people who go abroad and then come back probably have better life prospects. But key to what I said there is that they've come back. Doing a stint abroad gives you experience. And that will always be the case, even if that experience is actually a bad one.
It does, yeah. Look, as someone who's done it as well, moving abroad is also really hard. And being a first generation immigrant somewhere, there's lots of negatives to that, not being able to break through certain social barriers, all of those sort of pieces also remain intact as well. So, and also this is being asked by many people who may not have done it before, so there might be a bit of a bias in there, and that they would have loved to have done it themselves when they were younger, but they didn't. And to your point, David, the grass is always greener, right? Ireland is doing very well now. The economy is hot. People are being paid very well. And again, I can tell you this, as someone who's lived, I live in London now. I've lived in Toronto. The common theme about both those places actually is cost of living, and housing costs. And so, it's these same issues are not unique or kind of concentrated to Ireland. These are problems being faced across the wider Anglosphere, and I think sometimes maybe we're being a bit hard on ourselves in Ireland as how bad things are. Again, I think if we get the housing situation sorted, Ireland's a great place to be.
It is. I mean, I'm going to not bang on too much more about being down here in Dingle and having done some kayaking yesterday.
Are you in Dingle, David? I didn't know.
I think I should probably get commission now from the local tourist office for this. Yeah, but the guy who's doing a tour with us yesterday, right? Yeah. He had considered pre-COVID going to Australia, and then post-COVID considered going to Canada. He actually did applications for both at different times. Mm-hmm. But what he found was, emerging from COVID, was he could get the job doing kayaking. He does a mix of that, mix of working in a family member's pub, and on a sunny day, looking over the glistening Dingle Bay, his view was, you know what, I'm actually delighted that I'm here, and I'm not missing any of that stuff abroad. He knows people abroad. He knows he knows what his life could have been. But he's actually very content because he has a job here in a busy summer season, doing that kind of work here. And that for me was, the data point that we don't hear stories about. So we always have these polls, okay, X 50-60% of young people are considering going abroad. And then many do, but actually the majority don't, because you consider it, but then you consider not to. And that's the story that that's really my story of the week, actually, is someone who looked at it, but actually found something better here. And there is a lot of good stuff happening in Ireland. And the more people kind of get out there and see it and realize it, I think the difference is the grass being greener on the other side, it won't be that much greener.
What an uplifting way to end this week's episode, David. Let's end it there before we get into more negative, more negative conversations. David, good to see you. Glad you're having a good time in Dingle. I fly back to London from Prague later on today. And again, thank you all for listening and watching. Again, if you did like this podcast, please like, share, and subscribe. Again, please do that. We really need and appreciate your support. We'll look forward to seeing you and talking to you again next week. Talk to you then.